I'm Ioana. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham in the politics department. And today I will be sharing some insights from my doctoral research project, especially in relation to identity, as well as work and literatures related to work. So my four proposals for today are as follows. One is I propose that we need to, as Marxists interested in disability politics, we ought to consider potentially tweaking and building on the impaired disabled dialectic proposed by the UPS-inspired social modelists. And I will talk about that a bit later. I propose that we analyze how capitalism, and not simply society, is disabling. Thirdly, I make the case for the analytical usefulness of my proposed terms subjects of disablement and disabling capitalism. And finally, I will explore broadly the work undertaken by the research participants in this project and the literatures that I have used to make kind of sense of this. Now, the project itself is a doctoral project within the politics department. And at the start of the project, 27 participants took part in it, and they contributed through interviews, diaries, and post-diary interviews in 2020. All participants were, at the time of the interviews or just before, gig economy workers in various industries and contracts, and all self-identified as being either disabled, chronically ill, experiencing mental distress, being neurodivergent, and or having impairments. In terms of the research questions that I have posed myself and sought to address in the project, they relate to identity, which I will go into a bit more today, empirical findings about the waged and unwaged work that the participants undertook, and the benefits of synthesizing different theories, in particular post-68 Marxisms and the UPS-inspired social model of disability. And then my contributions are aimed at the discipline of critical political economy, activist spaces, as well as disability studies. So, to move on, I will start with the idea of identity in general. So I recommend the work of Marie Morin, who has written a book called Identity and Capitalism. Marie Morin has talked about identity from a cultural materialist perspective, following the work of Raymond Williams. And according to Morin, identity, kind of in general, is a historically contingent concept. It has undergone a significant change of meaning also since the 1950s, and we still feel that change today. But looking back, identity meant different things even in previous centuries. So, for instance, in the 16th century, identity was a marker of sameness and indivisibility of a person. So, despite changes to one's life, one continues to remain oneself. So, if you move through life and from a child you turn it into an adult, you're still yourself, even though, of course, you've changed over time. Now, 2 centuries later, the legal use of identity was invented, and that's also when identity theft started to be a practice. And the legal use of identity started with the creation of identity cards, and we still have them today. And then finally, from the mid-20th century, a historically novel and dual understanding of identity has been created. So we've got personal identity and social identity. And even there are differences in terms of the consumerist take on identity versus the radical political take. And I will build on this work, this is kind of the foundation of what is coming to be said today. But what I wanted to stress here with Marie Morin's work is that identity changes over time, and we don't even know how we will understand identity in, say, 50 years' time. So we need to be open to new interpretations and kind of be attuned to them. Now, I am sure that everyone in this room is aware of the different models of disability, but it's still important to be clear about my understanding of it and where I'm trying to kind of contribute. So there are a variety of models Scholar A.J. Withers identified 27 in their book, and perhaps there might be even more if we were to update the list now. So we've got the medical model, the cultural, liberal, postmodern, social, biopsychosocial, post-human, charity and tragedy, and I'll stop there. Some of them are called models, others approaches, but they kind of mean the same thing. But I follow the social model's main distinction, which is between the individual model, which is like an umbrella model, and the social model, though I have some tweaks to make there as well. So the individual, the social modelists regards the individual model as finding problems within individuals' body minds. So in order to become non-disabled, you need to fix yourself. So the story goes. But in addition to that, I would stress that the individual modelists also find solutions within individuals too. So for instance, the liberal model focuses on advancing individual rights, but it doesn't look at the structural problems of society. And then the social model is it emerged from a broadly socialist activist group in the 1970s in the UK, called the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPS. And for them, the problem, if we are to talk about problems, lies in how society is organized. So society disables people with impairments. And for them, disabled is a social and a political identity. Like a radical identity or a radical kind of politics approach to identity, as we discovered with Marie Morin's work. However, the social model's language has been appropriated over time, especially since the mid-1990s. So even the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK, as well as liberal academics, regard themselves as being social modelists or using social model language and tenets. And it got to the point where Vic Finkelstein, who is one of the co-founders of UPS, in the late 1990s said that the social model has become a quote-unquote potpourri because it has lost its critical edge. And also he claimed that disability studies has become disabling studies. So because of this potpourri kind of dimension of the social model these days, which still persists, I would argue, it is very important that whenever a social modelist does their work, they also are open and clear about what kind of strand of work they want to build on. So I specifically wish to build on the UPS-inspired social model rather than the more liberal approaches to the social model. So having explored identity in general and also different models of disability, I will now move on to talk about specific identities related to disability and one's body-mind. So those include the terms disabled person, neurodivergent, chronically ill, deaf, experiencing mental distress and having impairments. And I found a lot of disagreements in literature, in society, in academia, and also among activist groups. And in light of that, I thought, and also I interviewed participants who had different perspectives, and then I asked this question, what do we do? Can we find a commonality among all the people who are neurodivergent, chronically ill, and so on? Now, in terms of disagreements in society and literatures, I will list a few. So, as we've seen, there are different interpretations of disability because there are different models. Social modelists say that there is a distinction between disability and impairment. So impaired people are disabled by society. And some scholars and activists argue that chronic illness and neurodivergence are impairments. Whilst other activists say that mental distress, for instance, is not an impairment because distress is, if we regard distress as being an impairment, that would mean that we take an approach that problematically pathologizes this distress. Now, in other literatures, neurodivergence is treated as an advantage for productivity, thus reproducing the kind of productivity-based hierarchies. And they take like a positive and affirmative approach to neurodiversity, whereas others take a negative one. And in the UK, only 1 out of 4 of those who are disabled according to the law identify as such, according to an ONS, I think, survey that was done a few years ago. And some people's claims to disability are also being denied by the state, employers, and professionals, like medical professionals, for instance. And this especially happens in relation to people with chronic illness, who are neurodivergent, who experience mental distress. So we see here that there are a lot of kind of attitudes towards the term disabled, and some reject the term, others have the term denied to them, and then others are reticent, and I'll be going into the reticence bit later on in the presentation. There are also general disagreements in academia, and for want of a better expression, the language and the concepts used by the scholars in academia are all over the place. Often terms are used, or terms are not really explained in academic articles, even though they do have different meanings from scholar to scholar. And then even now, identity-related questions, for instance, in relation to whether we are disabled people or people with disabilities, so those kind of questions on mailing lists can lead to dozens of quite heated responses and disagreements. And this is not a bad thing. I'm just highlighting this as, even after the creation of the social model in the 70s, this debate about identity and the use of different terms is still ongoing and timely. Now, in terms of implications for activism and practice, self-organized groups may focus on specific body-mind related matters at times, and wouldn't necessarily link their struggle to kind of trying to change society or linking up with other people with other types of impairments or who are chronically ill and so on. And this siloed self-organizing can result in unnecessary divisions. And also a divided language inhibits coalitional politics. And language does matter for groups' constitutions, for instance. So I recall the UPS constitution made reference to people with physical impairments as being potential members, but they referred to people whom they used the term mentally ill as being a different oppressed group. So there, in their constitution, they kind of created some boundaries in terms of who is eligible and who is not. And so that was in the 70s, but then even nowadays, I found this example in Ellen Clifford's excellent book called The War on Disabled People. And there she stressed how differences over the naming of the coalition involved in monitoring the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2017 in the UK led to certain organizations to pull out. So again, language matters, and it has a material consequence on how we organize ourselves and mobilize our resources and create coalitions with others. Now, moving on to what participants have shared with me through the interviews, especially on questions related to identity, there was no clear consensus in relation to identification along disability and or body-mind lines. So the term disabled was used interchangeably with other terms at times, so disabled and chronically ill, for instance. Sometimes it was used exclusively, so only disabled person was the term they used, or not at all. So some participants would say that they have a particular condition or that they are neurodivergent and didn't necessarily use that term, disabled. And some participants did not use the term disabled due to not wishing to claim the term away from others. So they thought that they are not as disabled as other people, so they didn't want to kind of take up the space and the, say, voice of those who need that space. However, so in light of all of these things and the disagreements that I've mentioned in the previous slides, I thought what is still the commonality between all the participants in this project. And I took the approach of looking at what was said throughout the interviews and diaries without necessarily making reference to identity. And what I found is that everyone presented evidence of disablement-related oppression and exploitation. So everyone talked and brought a lot of kind of evidence of social barriers, social restrictions, prejudices, and the list goes on. So I found that this is the common material condition of everyday life for all participants in the project. They're all subjected to disablement. And I see disablement as a structural form of oppression and exploitation that is fundamental to capitalism, similarly to racialization and many other forms of oppression. And I'll talk about this more later on. And this type of disablement, or like disablement itself, is central to the reproduction of capitalism. So capitalism cannot function without it being disabling. And then the last slide for this second part of the presentation brings me to explaining kind of the reasoning behind my search for a new concept and a new term. So, as I mentioned before, there's a lack of consensus everywhere in relation to disability and body-mind related identities. I wished to avoid long lists of groups of people in the thesis itself. So kind of logistically speaking, I tried to avoid having to always write a long list because it impedes like reading and so on. But then also I wanted to avoid imposing the term disabled on those who do not use it. Although, of course, it's very useful as a shorthand, but I wanted to look beyond that. What else could I do? And I wanted to acknowledge the argument that mental distress is not an impairment. And in relation to this, I would stress that Ellen Clifford is doing some excellent work at the moment, reinvigorating the social model and creating a social model of impairment. So I'm sure she would have quite a lot to say around that argument. And I'm really excited to follow the kind of development of that work. Now to come back, not everyone who has an impairment or who is chronically ill, who has mental distress and who is deaf, is aware of it. And yet, even if you're not aware that you're autistic, for instance, that doesn't mean that you're not affected by disablement oppression in since day one. And so there's that group of people as well. And finally, I wanted to build on the UPS-inspired social model of disability and combine it with the recent Marxist work, and also link it to class. And in order to do that, and this will be kind of the next topic of my third part of the presentation, I wanted to not just come up with a term that is the subject of disablement. I wanted to think about what kind of theory could be brought behind it, or what kind of justifications could there be for a term such as subjects of disablement, in order for myself and others to kind of build on that theory and kind of critically reflect on the term, and not on the term but also what it does to politics and to how we organize ourselves and so on. So now I will move to the third part of the presentation, and I'm on time, so I'll take a bit of water. This is slightly drier in a sense, this part, so apologies in advance, but I found the work of Marxist autonomist Salar Mohandesi to be very helpful here. So Salar Mohandesi and other autonomist Marxists make a distinction between class consciousness and class composition, and these are two theories. And class consciousness theory is the approach taken by orthodox Marxists, whereby class is understood to go through two phases, and that is class in itself, which represents working class people, like everyone who lives under capitalism and is exploited under capitalism. And then we've got class in itself, and that is working class people who are conscious of their class position and also who organize themselves politically to change the social relations that they live through and under. Now, this is a very interesting and good framework to use, but it does have some limitations, which Salar Mohandesi has highlighted among others. So there is a slight problem with the idea of organizers needing to raise consciousness of those who don't have it yet. Because so if you try to raise consciousness and the other person doesn't agree with you, then do they have false consciousness? And then what do you do from there? How do you build coalitional politics based on this kind of psychologizing approach? And it can also lead to hierarchical relations between kind of organizers and those who are considered to be kind of deorganized in a way. So then we've got, as a kind of a friendly critique of class consciousness, the class composition theory. And within class composition theory, there is such a thing as the technical composition and the political composition. So in the technical composition of class, just like the class in itself, we've got working class people who are all exploited under capitalism. And then class composition, on the other hand, it's how working class people organize themselves politically. So then with this framework, the concern or the kind of task of Marxists is to look at how people organize themselves, to kind of map the political kind of organizing and find ways of building coalitional politics. So there, of course, there is also an element of consciousness there, but that's not the driving force of this kind of thinking in relation to class and class formation. And moving on from class composition and class consciousness, I have used these two frameworks to link them to disability politics. And I argue that the UPS-inspired social modelists adopt the disability consciousness, like class consciousness theory, in that they consider people with impairments to be to kind of form the disability in itself. And then we've got disabled people who are disability for itself. So disabled people who are people who have impairments and who are conscious of the fact that they are disabled by society, and they organize themselves on that basis. And I've got a quote by Oliver, but I won't go into it because of time limits, which kind of it's kind of very clearly demonstrates that this framework is kind of assumed by social modelists. And then it's got the same kind of problems with psychologizing politics and creating some sort of a hierarchy between those who organize and those who need to be organized. So in light of this, I propose the disability composition theory, whereby I follow the autonomist Marxist approach to class and I transpose it into disability. And here we've got subjects of disablement as the technical composition of disability. So this is how people are materially constituted in capitalist societies. And that includes neurodivergent people with impairments, chronically ill, deaf, with experiences of mental distress, and very importantly, other future identities and body-mind terms. And as we remember from Marie Morin's work, identity will keep changing, so we don't even know what terms we will be mobilizing around in future. So that's the technical composition, subjects of disablement. And then for the political composition, how people organize themselves politically, we can talk about disabled people as the political composition of disability, as well as mad and creep activists and other political groups and identities that have been forming in the UK. But I have put disabled people in the middle, partly because I'm focusing on the UPS inspired model, and in my mind that they continue to fit together. So then the question becomes, how can political coalitions be built? How do we map the political presence and organizing of different groups? And what is the political difference between them? And partly to recap, the term subjects of disablement is in my framework a non-identitarian analytical concept that reflects the technical composition of disability. And it is a term for anti-capitalists and UPS-inspired social modelists to adopt. It's not a term that I think fits within, say, a post-humanist approach to disability or other approaches that don't really take seriously the question of class and the question of changing actually capitalism itself. And this term also highlights the structural subjectivation of people, neurodivergent people, chronically ill people, people with impairments, people who are deaf, who experience mental distress, through disabling capitalism. And capitalism has been missed in disability-related literature over the past few years. And what I'm trying to do is to kind of bring it back and to put it at the center of our discussion. So, and also to place disability and disablement next to capitalism, similarly to how scholarship has been developed in relation to racial capitalism. And finally, this term subjects of disablement is linked to and embedded within class composition theory. So a lot of more work could be done to explore and develop further this notion of subjects of disablement. And finally, it is a term, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's quite a long term and it's a mouthful, but I wanted to avoid finding euphemisms or terms that don't really have much clear meaning. So in my mind, subjective disablement was the most clear way of highlighting this relationship between a person who has experiences of mental distress and disabling capitalism. And key points in relation to this third section are to take home are that the UPS-inspired social modelists argue that society disables people, which I agree with as the notion and their idea. But I would add that society is difficult to theorize, and it's partly because they talked about society being disabling and not capitalism. That's partly why I would argue the DWP and liberal academics and others have managed to appropriate the social model language and framework. So I would rather shift the focus from society to capitalism as disabling the subjects of disablement. And disablement is central to the reproduction of capitalism, as I mentioned before. I would tweak the impaired disabled dialectic as a friendly critique of the UPS-inspired social model, and I would turn it into subjects of disablement disabled instead. And I think it's very important to stress here that I'm not saying that the word disabled is just to be used for political organizing. Of course, it has legal meanings and so on. But if we are to think about kind of research and politics and analysis and so on, this dialectic is better. And finally, the aim is the self-abolition of the collective identity disabled people and the abolition of disabling capitalism itself. So the idea, for instance, that there can be such a thing as a disabled future as a good thing, as a positive thing, which is an argument that some scholars make, doesn't really resonate with this framework. Because actually we need to get rid of disablement, not celebrate it.